Well, hey, we are in week number 2 of this little mini 4-part series on going deeper. Now, the reason that I decided to do this series was because most of us desire to grow and change. Most people do. Most people don't want to stay the same, and it doesn't matter if you're a Christian or not. People want to change. People want to grow, and you'll hear and you see lots of self-help stuff right now, especially because it's the new year. Everybody wants you to do stuff. Most people don't go into a year hoping to be the exact same person at the end of the year that they were at the start of the year. Right? They look at it, it might be. But here's the thing, let's be honest. Many of you are not the kind of people that set goals. Okay? If I said, how many people here love to set goals and make resolutions? You might get a couple of hands. A lot of you aren't that excited about New Year's resolutions, and the few times you did it, they were done by January 31st or January 1st. I don't know, right? It just doesn't always work. On the other hand, though, there are some people in this room that love to set goals. I mean, January 1st is a new journal and a new notebook and a new thing to write in. You're excited and you do that. But I mean, let's be honest, even if you're that person, it can get a little discouraging at times because we tend to tread water in those critical areas of our life way too often. But the problem is this. We can't afford to just ignore all this and say, well, I'm not really a goal setter, life will be what it is, because positive change and growth is rarely accidental. It just doesn't happen that way. And so if we're going to go deeper this year, and if that's what we're going to do, and as we sit on the edge of this, if we want to push further into who God is, into how we deal with other people in the world around us, we are going to have to do this very intentionally. And it might require us changing some ways of thinking because we're sitting here today on January the 10th. There's a lot of year in front of us as of today. And so what is that going to look like? And so if you were here last week, and if you weren't, you didn't see it online, I would encourage you to listen. We started off this whole series by looking at this idea of loss and grief. And the reason we started there is we said it's very hard to go deeper, to change anything, if we haven't dealt with the things that we've lost from the past. A lot of times there's kind of like an anchor on our soul, things that we're holding on to. And what I encouraged you last week was to do 2 things, if you remember. I said, I want you to go through and consider what are those things personally? What are the things you've lost in this last year? It may be longer, but the things that have been really difficult. I did this exercise. Yvonne and I did this once in the middle of feeling COVID sick, which is, by the way, a very bad time to do this because everything's negative, right? But we were talking about it. We said, well, what have we lost? And we started to make a list. Because here's the thing. Even though this year was a year of transition and change and a whole lot of good new things, there were a whole lot of losses. And so we have to understand those at a personal level before we can move forward if we're going to go deeper. And then I encourage you to do that in relation to our church. To say, what is that? What are those things that over the years, especially if you've been here a long time, that you feel like have been lost, that might make it difficult to fully embrace what God is doing in the future? Kind of a bench-sitting kind of thing. I hope you did this. And as we sit here this morning, I want to dig into these next 3 weeks, these different areas. Because while goals themselves are great and resolutions are good, I have no problem with them. I think they can be a good thing. That's not really what I want to talk about today. I want to look in these next 3 weeks at this idea about going deeper with God, going deeper with each other, and going deeper with the world. And they're all interrelated. They're never separate. But I want to take a look at a different aspect of each. So as we sit here and we have this whole year in front of us, here's what I do know that's the same for every single person who's in this room. Regardless of your age, how much money you have, your gender, doesn't matter. Whatever it is, if you live through this year, okay, you will have exactly the same amount of time available to you as the next person. Nobody has less. Nobody has more. We all have exactly the same. Now, that's what's common. And let's be honest, even some of the things we'll experience will be common, because if you took 2 people, first of all, there's some things that are just common to everybody. If we had sat here, had this same discussion January 10th of 2020, and I said, oh, by the way, we're going to spend the whole year sharing in a global pandemic together, right? First of all, everybody said, what, you're crazy, but that's something we share in together. You go through a national election together, right? There's certain shared experiences. And then if you think about it, even from the perspective of people, two people can share very similar experiences. So in the course of 2021, lots of things can happen. And two different people could lose a job, or two different people could get jobs, or two different people could end relationships, or two people might both get sick, or lose someone, or get promoted, or get a job, or all those things. But even when the experiences are similar, they're not the same. And you all know this because whenever you talk to someone, they say, oh, I know how you feel. What's your first thought in your head? No, you don't. See, you all know exactly because you've all thought that exact same thing. Someone says, oh, I know how you feel. No, you don't. No, you don't. Because every experience is unique to you. And that includes your spouse or your kids. And what is true is this. Some people will leverage the experiences of 2021 towards a deeper and more satisfying relationship with God. And some people will not. And curiously, whether the experiences are good or bad or really heavy or light seems to have no bearing on whether that's true or not. So what does? What makes the difference? Thomas Edison very famously tried 2,000 different materials in his search for the right filament, to do a light bulb. You all remember this from your high school science? And when none of them worked, and his assistant famously complained, our work is in vain, we've learned nothing. And Thomas Edison said, oh, we've come a long way. We've learned a lot. We know there are 2,000 elements that do not work, right? Different perspective, a different view. And I thought, as we want to go deeper with God in 2021, a lot of this depends on perspective. And so what I'm going to call it this morning, and I don't know if this is the right term, it's maybe clunky, but I think it captures it. If we want to go deeper with God, we have to view our experiences through what I will call an evaluative lens. We have to see what happens in and to us and around us through something I'll call the principle of evaluated experience, because experience alone will never take you deeper with God, but evaluated experience will. So I want to unpack this a little bit. We're going to use Psalm 90 to do it. If when we start reading this seems familiar to you, it's because it gets used a lot at funerals. So if you've been to funerals, you've probably heard pieces or portions of this psalm. But it wasn't really written for that purpose. It's not why it was written. And it's considered by some to be one of the oldest, if not the oldest psalm in the Psalms. Because if you read it in your Bible, it'll say Psalm 90, a psalm of Moses, the man of God. And so there's a lot of scholars who believe this was written by Moses way back when. They don't know for sure when in his life, but it was definitely later in his life. And the focus of this entire psalm is on this idea of evaluated living. Okay? Now, before we read the psalm, I've got to give you some context. You all know this, but it'll help us as we do this. Moses was a Hebrew, an Israelite, but he didn't grow up that way. Right? You all know the story. He got put in the basket in the Nile. He gets fished out, and he gets put into the family of the most powerful nation in that part of the entire planet. And so he gets to grow up. He spends 40 years growing up in the palace. He's adopted to the highest family in Egypt. And so he had access to education, to power, to training, to all the stuff that you wish you had access to. I mean, it's like Harvard for free, right? And he got to do everything they wanted. He had the best music teachers. I mean, he had the people teaching him philosophy. I mean, he had everything. But at some point along the way, he came to the conclusion that wasn't enough. He said, I'm a Hebrew. I know I'm a Hebrew. I want my people to not be in slavery anymore. I got to do something about it. And so, of course, he tries to do something. Doesn't work very well. He ends up killing an Egyptian. And for his trouble, he gets exiled and he flees for his life. And he then proceeds to spend 40 years, and arguably the best 40 years of his life, as a shepherd. Do you know what the schedule of a shepherd is? When the sun comes up, you get up. You sit around sheep all day, and when the sun goes down, you go to sleep, maybe. And then you get up and you do it again. And he did it for 40 years. Think of how long 2020 felt. 1 year. And so for 40 years, Moses, after having seen amazing things, done amazing things, with all those amazing opportunities in Egypt, with all that, spends it getting sunburned. Yeah, he finds family along the way. It's not all just that. But it seemed only when his best years were behind him did God come to give him a job that he didn't want and that he wasn't equipped for. Now keep all that in mind as we read this psalm. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read it all first. We're actually going to stop at verse 12. There's a little bit more after that. I'm going to read through it, and then I'm going to unpack it a little bit. Okay? Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust, you mortals. By the way, doesn't that sound like a Gandalf moment? Return to dust, you mortals. If you don't know who Gandalf is, he's a wizard. It's Lord of the Rings, anyway. It's this very dramatic thing. That's kind of what that sounds like to me. 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. Yet you sweep people away in the sleep of death. They are like the new grass of the morning. In the morning it springs up new, but by evening it is dry and withered. We are consumed by your anger, terrified by your indignation. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. And all of our days pass away under your wrath, and we finish our years with a moan. Our days might come to 70 years, or 80, if our strength endures. Yet the best of them, remember Moses' best years, are but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass and we fly away. If only we knew the power of your anger. Your wrath is as great as the fear that is your due. And here's the crux of the whole psalm. Teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Teach us to number our days. So what does that mean? I've heard people preach this about being better time managers, more efficient, setting better goals. I've heard some people say, no, this is just all about the fact that you have to realize that you're not going to live very long and you're going to die, so live your life that way. Neither of those, while there might be aspects, it's not really what Moses is getting at. He's talking about the principle of an evaluated life. So let me unpack that a little bit for us. We're going to start at verse 12 and work our way backwards a little bit. Because here's the thing, and Moses knew this after spending all those years in the backcountry with nothing and then, being called by God, is that if we want depth, if you want to go deeper with God in this year, it requires evaluated experience. There's a very famous quote by a guy named George Santayana. I'm going to show you in a second. But people often think that just living life and having experiences makes you wiser, right? You have to get older, wiser. And you all know that's not true. Because you know people who are 65 and you think, what is wrong with them? Right? You're 65 years old. Why are you acting like you're still in the 10th grade? There are people who have had tons of experiences. They are no wiser and no deeper than they were 50 years earlier. Because experience by itself does not bring wisdom, but evaluated experience brings wisdom. Very famous quote by George Santayana said, those who can't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. You've all heard that before, right? And it's been used in multiple places. It's been used with the military. But it's this whole idea of evaluating the past. Blockbuster, for those of you that have been around a while, remember the Blockbuster company? It started in 1985. So it started when I was, teenager, almost married. And by 2004, so that's only 20 years, they employed 84,000 people and had 9,000 stars. It was actually arguably the most iconic brand. By the way, if you're under 20, you're like, who are you talking about? Okay, but Blockbuster, big video place, and just in the gaming space and everything. And in 2000, so they are well on their way to growth, a company came to Blockbuster and they offered to sell their company to Blockbuster for $50 million. And the CEO, he wasn't interested. He saw it was a small niche business at the time. It was losing money. He didn't care. And in 2010, Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy. Well, that small company that they declined to buy continued to grow, and as of 2020, Netflix is worth almost $200 billion. The people at the top thought they had it all figured out. They knew what things were. They knew what everything was. There was no sense of evaluation that goes on. So when it comes to spiritual growth and going deeper this year, it's the exercise of evaluating our experiences that leads to deeper growth. So Moses said it this way: teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. This is a prayer, by the way. It's the only part in the entire psalm where Moses zeroes in. He's been talking, but then he says, God, this is what I want. This is what I want you to do. I need you to teach me how to do this. Have you ever done this? You ever numbered your days? All right? Maybe it's like this. I picked the first day of my life, and I'm like, okay, I am now 52 and a half years old. Do you know what that means? That means I've lived for 19,164 days. Which also means I've lived for 459,936 hours. That's a long time. Or 27.596 million minutes. Or 1.655 billion seconds. And that number is going up tick, 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 all the time. Right? Is that what it means? When Moses says to number our days, is that what he's talking about? Hey, I got to number your days. You got to see how old you are. That can be a bit depressing, maybe sobering at the best. But that's not really what Moses is getting at. Moses is saying, look, I'm writing this prayer because I want to gain a heart of wisdom. There's something about numbering your days that changes how we think. In other words, if we want to go deeper and if we want to grow, we have to be taught to number our days. And so what Moses is saying, Lord, teach us to live with the idea in mind that we are not infinite. By the way, you've all done this, right? You've all actually numbered your days, because a better picture of numbering your days is like, think back, ladies, to your wedding day, okay? And if someone came to you and said, how many days to your wedding? You'd say, it's 26 days, 17 hours, and 32 minutes, right? You knew when that was coming. You were looking forward to it. And if I said to you, what has to happen between now and then? You would say, I know exactly what needs to happen. This and this and this and this. And you had a list. And you're like, these are the things. They have to happen. They have to be ready, right? You know how that works. Or think about it. You've got a major test coming at school. When's your test? Oh, it's next Tuesday at 2 o'clock. I mean, you know how long it's going to be. If I say, well, what do you have to do to get ready for your test? You know exactly what you got to do. I got to study this chapter, and I got to study this chapter, and I got to do this homework. I got to be ready. Or if you have a big presentation at work or something like that, and you know exactly how long it is before that thing is going to happen, and you know exactly what has to be done before it happens. Even for good stuff. When's vacation? Right? I can't tell how many times I see people say, how much time to vacation? 32 days, 19 hours, 6 minutes. And if you ask that person what needs to be done, they know exactly what needs to be done. That is numbering your days. Now, here's the problem. It's not just about planning and better resolutions, because when it comes to life, we don't know what the last day is. We don't know. When is that? No one really knows how much time they have left. So it's pretty easy when you say, well, I got 4 weeks till vacation. I got to get these things done, or 2 weeks till exams. But what do you do when you look into the future and there's no real date? So what Moses is starting out, he's saying, look, guys, I need to be taught. God, you have to show me how to live my life in light of the fact that I'm not infinite. That's where he's ending. That's the ending prayer. But everything he writes before that gives context to this. So here's where we're going to go with this. Evaluation then, right? Evaluated experience is what gives depth. Well, what does that mean? Well, evaluated experiences requires correct lenses, correct context. There are lots of people around you that evaluate their experiences, but they're doing it from the wrong context, and so it doesn't really help them. And what I mean by that is this. Most people evaluate their life through the lens of what? Me, myself. That's how I see everything. Everything that I'm doing and everything that happens to me is evaluated through the lens of me. The context is themselves. You just have to watch the news, listen to celebrities, watch what people do. The entire way they filter all their information is through how it affects me. What does it mean to me? And so that's what they do. But Moses is saying that's not the correct context. So he begins this entire psalm with this interesting statement. He says, Lord, you have been our dwelling place for all generations. In other words, for our nation, for Israel, you're the place we've come. Right? You're the one who we find all of our safety in. You're, with the temple and everything, we come to you. But it's even bigger than that, because before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. In other words, before anything ever was created, you were here. And when this is all done and everything is finished and it's all returned to dust, you'll be here. This is the context for everything I'm going to say after this. This is the context for teaching you to number our days. It's understanding that the context for your story in 2021 is a broader narrative. It's not you. You are not the context for the story. So I need you to picture this. I was going to try and wheel out a bookshelf and kind of picture it that way. So you got to work with me here. So I want you to picture, you maybe have these in your home. You have a bookshelf and you got a whole bunch of books on it. Okay? And there's all these different books. It can even better if you picture a series, a series of books where they're all part of the same story. Maybe it's a 7 or 8 book series or something like that. And you have all these books, and here's how we picture our life. We picture page 1 over here as being our birth, and page whatever it is over here as being our death, and our life is everything. This is the context of our life in between. And God says, wrong context. Because as long as this story, this whole series of stuff is about you, everything you evaluate in your life will be about you. He said, I want you to think differently. Picture instead that in this entire 1,000-page or thousands of pages of series, there's one page right here in the middle. And if I was to go in and tear that page out and look at the top paragraph, that's your life. Because the context for evaluating your life is everlasting to everlasting with God in the middle. And Moses is saying, look, you have to understand, people, if you're going to have the right context is that God has always been, God always will be, and he fills everything up in the middle. Now, what does that sounds nice, but what does that actually mean? It's hugely important, because this is actually how, if we're going to evaluate our lives this year, we have to take this text. So Moses, he's going to fill this out, because he says, I want you to understand the context is, everlasting to everlasting, God in the middle. What does that look like? What does that mean to you as you take that one page? He says, well, you return people back to dust. God's basically saying, look, no matter what happens, no matter who you are, no matter how rich you are, no matter how powerful you are, eventually God says, you're done. And you're back to dust. You cease to exist anymore. You won't be here. No matter who you are, this is your end. He goes on to say, look, 1,000 years is like just a day gone by. Have you ever thought that through? Do you know what was happening 1,000 years ago right now? The Crusades. Constantinople being conquered by people who were signing up. This is what was going on 1,000 years. Think how much has happened since then. And it's like he's saying, you know what? That 1,000 years, that's like a day. In fact, you know what? It's not even that. It's a watch of the night. A watch was a 3 or 4 hour time block where someone would stay awake to watch the sheep or watch what was going on to make sure no one attacked. He's saying, look, all that time is like that. If that's true, what is your life? Yet you sweep people away in the sleep of death. They're like new grass in the morning, it springs up new, by evening it's dry and withered. We are ephemeral, we are temporary, we don't live very long. Now hear me clearly, okay? Moses' point is not that your life doesn't matter. But what he is saying this. You cannot create meaning on your own because you don't live long enough to make that happen. You cannot be the filter through which you evaluate your experiences because you just aren't around long enough. History is filled with people who tried to make it about them, about their achievements. One of the things that fascinated me when we moved to the United States was listening to presidents. Do you know that since I've lived here for 23, 24 years, whatever it is now, every time a new president comes in, do you know what they talk about? Their legacy. They want to leave a legacy. They're all so worried about their legacy. And here's the funny part about it. Any one of them that was all about themselves, history never looks at them kindly. That's been true of all of history. Anybody who exists just for themselves, history will look back on them and it won't look back on them well. Because the entire context was for them. All you have to do is watch Keeping Up with the Kardashians. What do you think history is going to say about that? All about me, all about us. And yet this is everywhere. It's endemic in our society. These men and women have poured themselves out to be famous, to get a legacy, and it never comes out right. And so Moses says, look, in the end, your days might come to 70 years or 80, if your strength endures, if you get lucky. But the best of them are just trouble and sorrow. For they quickly pass and we fly away. I found out this week by doing the research, by the way, on this, that there's actually reasons why time seems to go faster when we get older. Right? It doesn't actually go faster, but there's actually been done studies and there's scientific reasons why that seems to happen. If you're curious, talk to me after. Okay. The longer we see this, though, the more this is true. But then, and this is the part that was kind of funny, because in between this statement here, where he's just described, here's why you have to have your context as God, because our lives just aren't that long. And then if you remember, he does this prayer, so teach us to number our days. There's this very odd little verse that seems like it's misplaced in Moses' writings, right in between these. Because it says, if only we knew the power of your anger, and you're thinking, what? That doesn't even make sense. If only we knew the power of your anger. The implication is, we don't know. If only we understood, we don't understand. If only we got it, well, apparently we don't. If only we knew the power of your anger. And then, and this is kind of a clunky phrase, but I guess this is the best they can do in English with the original Hebrew phrase. He says, your wrath is as great as the fear that is your due. Which is kind of a little difficult to grab, and so you can go do the research on this if you'd like. But basically it means this. If we could see God the way he really is, then we would give him the reverence that he is due. If we could actually see him for what he is. And remember who is writing this. I don't know when he wrote it in his life, but if he wrote it toward the end of his life, this is being written by a man who got as close to seeing the face of God as anybody who's ever lived. This was the man who came off the mountain with his face shining, that people were terrified because he was still reflecting what he had seen before. And Moses is saying, look, if we just could get this, it would utterly change how we view God. And then he says, so teach us to number our days. Interesting. Since God is eternal and we're not, since he is so much big, his plans are so much bigger than our little plans, since he is so much more big and holy and powerful than we can imagine, since our lives are so short and just a blip on the radar screen of history, since the best center of our story is not us, since all that is true, teach us and show us, God, how to live an evaluated life. Because if we could see more clearly, we would live more purposefully. Moses, who spent huge chunks of his life seemingly wasted in the backcountry. Moses, who rejected the privilege of his youth and then had to lead a squabbling and contentious group of people. Moses, who was revered as one of the most greatest, most amazing leaders in history, came to this conclusion about going deeper with God. Live your life as if it has a point, and you're not it. So how do you do this? So here's one, because of course I'm thinking through all this. I'm thinking, so what's the grab? How can we take this away? What do we do if we want to live in 2021 and we want to go deeper so that when we have this conversation a year from now, you can say, oh, yeah, it's deeper. My relationship with God isn't the same. And you'll have a whole bunch of things that have happened between now and then. So how do we do that? So here's what I want you to practice. If you want to leverage all these experiences in front of you to go deeper, here's the question I want you to practice this year. What story do I want to tell? At the end of all this, and at the end of this year, and all those experiences that are going to happen into and around you, what story do I want to tell? Because here's the thing. You don't get to choose the experiences of this year. You don't get to pick. The vast majority of them are out of your control. They're going to happen to you. They're going to happen around you. Nobody would have picked COVID. Nobody would have picked a lot of these things. Stuff is just going to happen. You don't get to choose that. But here's what you get to choose. You get to choose how you respond to each and every one of those experiences. And someday, you will tell your family, your friends, or maybe just yourself, and you're going to tell a story about what you are experiencing right now. And the question is, what do you want that story to sound like? Because when you evaluate your experiences through the lens that Moses laid out, it changes things. Because we begin to see our life and our experience in light of this greater narrative of God. And it gives perspective and purpose and meaning to how we respond. Because what we normally do is we just respond. And then later we look back and go, oh, I shouldn't have done that. That wasn't a good decision. Shouldn't have really done that. In reality, if we said, okay, in light of the fact that my life is short and God is big and he's up to something, what kind of story do I want to tell? Because when we see our life and our experiences in the light of God's narrative, it'll actually help us to go deeper. And it lets us let God leverage our time, our days, and our experiences for his glory. And that's worth it. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, would you teach us to number our days? And I know, God, this is not the same for each person. Perhaps this is easier to do when we're older. I don't know. Maybe it's difficult for someone to do this when they're 10 or 12 or 14, because life is just all about what happens next. Maybe we're the kind of people that don't necessarily think this way. We don't actually process. We just go through life doing one experience to the next. So however you do this, and for wherever we're at, and however you've created us to be, would you teach us how to number our days? Remind us that we are in the midst, our story is in the midst of a narrative that is so much bigger, so much broader, and so much grander than our life. So would you remind us that we really need to write our story in your context? Not because we need to be discouraged about what we can or cannot do, but that you've actually given us the privilege of being a page in a story that matters. So as we go through this year, whether it's something that happens this week, or somewhere in the middle of May, or in November of next year, or over the course of the summer, whatever those things are, would you remind us to ask ourselves the question, what kind of story do we want to tell? And then show us what you want us to do to line that story up with yours. Thank you for the time you have gifted to us. We want to be a people that doesn't waste it. And so we ask all these things in the name of your Son, the eternal one, Jesus Christ. Amen. Hey, have a fantastic week. If you're online, have a great day as well. We'd love to see you back here. Be listening. Our plan right now is that at the end of the month, January 31st, so 3 weeks from today, we want to have an annual our first ever vision and celebration service. That's going to be a service that's going to be very difficult for you to participate from at home. We were still going to do it, but there's going to be something about being in person that day, so I want to encourage you to be here if you're comfortable. But be listening for that because it's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to have some good times with that. So have a great week. It's great to be back, and I look forward to seeing you all next Sunday. See you later.